Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and I want to thank AERA, Felice Levine, Tom Ketchkamethi, the American Academy for Political and Social Sciences for inviting me to join you today at this briefing. It's a privilege and an honor to be able to share some findings from my own research and some general thoughts with you who are key thought leaders and decision makers about public education today. In my 6 3/4 minute, I want to situate my own sociological and educational research studies within this larger body of social science research findings that you've heard about, particularly as we continue to grapple with the prevalent and pervasive patterns of achievement disparities by race, by ethnicity, class, and gender over the last half century or more. But I want to step back because I always find it quite curious as we think about the Coleman Report in the contemporary era, more than 50 years later, that then we were talking about the power of schooling in the wake of Jim Crow and de jure segregation. And today, we're talking about the power of schooling in the wake of civil rights legislation. Then versus now is very important to consider. And while Coleman drew our attention to family influence at that time, which was significant, since particularly many African Americans, and those were the students of color he was talking about primarily at that time, were living in families whose parents were the descendants of slaves, who had, many of them were not even first-generation readers themselves. Today there was on Twitter a call for how many of you, what generation readers are you? And I thought that was a particularly interesting question because I realized on my mother's side, I'm just a second-generation reader. My grandparents were illiterate. And so there wasn't sufficient variation in the 1960s to even strongly compare black and white students from resource-rich families and schools versus their counterparts who were in poor schools. It was pretty much homogenous for African Americans then. And so it's not necessarily a surprise, I guess, for us to realize that schools didn't have much effect on African American students, although there were drastic differences in terms and variation for those who were white. But contemporary research tells us that the story about schools and family effects on academic outcomes is quite nuanced and complex. The contemporary research also evinces the enduring effects of greater structural issues such as poverty and racism. And it's important to use that word, racism. Nationally representative studies like my colleague here, Sean Reardon, we've mentioned the economist Raj Chetty, whose work was just recently this week featured in the New York Times about intergenerational mobility. These studies with these large data sets point to the ecological dissimilarity between affluent and low-income students, and that affluence in that impoverished state or low-income state is highly correlated with race and ethnicity in America. And what we mean and what I mean, I'm drawing on the work of Robert Sampson, the sociologist of neighborhood effects, and William Julius Wilson. When we talk about ecological dissimilarity among various classes of students, we're talking about the dissimilarity in terms of their family, their community, and their school context. In today's society, we're asking groups of students, and I use this analogy, who have access to elevators moving at the rate of a bullet speed train. There are those who are on escalators, well-oiled cogs that are moving steadily up and up each floor, and those who are on stairwells with missing handrails and broken steps. And we're asking them all to get to the proverbial floor 16 at the same rate on average. If they don't, that's the achievement gap. But it is the opportunity gaps that drive the achievement gaps, the modes of mobility. And in American society, we have never gotten to a point where there is actually ecological similarity for various groups. And that is if the context did not matter. then why is it that we wouldn't have more families just not caring about what neighborhoods they live in? So we just have to ask that question, and I'm going to put that there. But what the research is suggesting is that ecological and educational disparities are an outcome of a host of contextual factors. It's not an either or a both, but rather a both and. The Coleman report found some positive effects for African American students' performance, in particular when they were in school with white students. And what others and I have found in our research is that equal opportunity context within schools is not even guaranteed. Consequently, when we experimented with the project of integration, we didn't often find, some research didn't often find the kinds of positive outcomes that we anticipated. In research that I've written and is documented in what my last book, Stubborn Roots, as well as a fair number of studies, is that we can see that there's also unequal outcomes within schools that are so-called good schools because their test scores are good on average. Why is that? The unequal experiences of students of color and often low-income students in terms of tracking or ability grouping, limited access to AP and honors courses, the creation of territories out of different extracurricular activities that are often conducive to academic mobility. These processes of engagement are shown to have some association with overall academic ability. In so-called good schools, and certainly in the research that I've conducted in schools in the U.S. and South Africa, we have found limited availability of access within schools that were actually producing highly extraordinary outcomes for affluent white and Asian students, but underperformance for African American and Latinx students, often from low-income backgrounds. Most of our nationally representative studies also, I would argue, and this is one critique of the Coleman report, have had limited availability of truly school-specific data and information versus aggregate district data that would illuminate the various mechanisms within schools that create these pattern outcomes by race, ethnicity, and class. That's why I go into schools as an interpretive and observational researcher, because we see them. But that kind of research has not been scaled on a massive level for us to be able to uncover them and then translate those into more valid and reliable quantitative measures. So I want to suggest to you this afternoon that we need also better indicators, and we need multiple indicators of students' educational well-being, not just test scores. The research is also showing that social, psychological, cultural, and political factors, sometimes intangible, but observable and felt and experienced when we are inside of schools, may either facilitate or impede the inclusion and equal educational opportunities for students, particularly those from historically disadvantaged backgrounds. Now, this comment pertains to some research that I've also conducted when we think about the degree and the incidence, high incidence of suspensions and expulsions in American schools that disproportionately affect African American boys, who we know now are sometimes 10 to 20 times more likely to be expelled or suspended, and later as adult men to be imprisoned. The Chatty research study that came out in the New York Times just this past week, from his large data set, we see that African American males on one particular given day, 10% of them were imprisoned, 10 to 20 times greater than any other race, gender group in the country. Black boys are less likely to be given the benefit of the doubt in terms of perceptions. They can't be mischievous. They can't be naughty. They're often criminalized as early as the research shows as 4 or 5. What are the implications for this kind of research on the long-term academic mobility? These boys and these girls oftentimes, too, suffer educationally, they suffer physically, they suffer spiritually. So in closing, I want to say that the holistic opportunity context, the systems from schooling do not look the same both inside and outside of schools for all groups. We've had ecological dissimilarity historically in American society. And any walls that attempt to separate what goes on outside of schools from what goes on inside of schools are an illusion. Contemporary research findings call for, no, let me say they beg for, conjoining various effective social, as Susan mentioned, and educational policies and practices that will radically reduce the effects of poverty, and yes, racism, racial discrimination, racial inequality, that sounds more benign, on the lives of African American, Latinx, and Native American students' overall well-being. That's what I have to say this afternoon. Thank you for listening.
Thank you to all of our speakers. Before we